The morning of my grandfather's will reading, my brother showed up in a new car. He pulled into the parking lot of Aldridge and Pierce Law Group like he was arriving at a premier charcoal suit, fresh haircut, the kind of easy smile that lives on people who've never once had to worry about rent. I watched him through the lobby glass as I waited in a chair I'd been sitting in for 20 minutes alone, my coat still damp from the Chicago rain. He didn't look my way when he walked in. He rarely did. My dad was already inside the conference room when I arrived. He was seated at the head of the table in the way that certain men sit, like every chair is a throne by default. My stepmother was beside him, her nails tapping lightly on the mahogany. My brother settled in across from me with the quiet satisfaction of someone who already knows the ending. I had never felt more like a guest in a room I was invited to. Mr. Aldridge entered precisely at 10, set a leather portfolio on the table, and began reading without ceremony. To my son, Richard, my father, he left the primary shares of Hartwell Industries, the family's commercial real estate development firm, along with the investment portfolio and the Scottsdale property. My dad exhaled slowly through his nose and gave my stepmother a look that said, "I told you so," to a conversation I wasn't part of. To my grandson, my brother, he received the Chicago condo, a cash trust, and the vintage car collection stored in Phoenix. He laughed once, short and sharp, and covered it with a cough. Then Mr. Aldridge paused. He glanced at me over the rim of his glasses in the way people do when they're about to say something they'd rather not. To my granddaughter, Nora, I leave the contents of Storage Unit 14, located at Lockwood Self-Storage, Edinburgh, Scotland. She will know what to do with it. No one spoke for exactly 3 seconds. Then my stepmother pressed her lips together into a shape that was trying very hard not to be a smile. My brother leaned back in his chair and said, "Edinburgh?" like it was the funniest word he'd ever heard. My dad looked at me with an expression I recognized, the one he used when he was embarrassed on my behalf, and said, "Well, your grandfather always had a flair for the dramatic." Mr. Aldridge slid a small envelope across the table. Inside was a folded note on cream-colored paper and a single brass key, old and heavier than it looked, with the number 14 stamped into the bow. The note was in my grandfather's handwriting, steady, deliberate, the way he'd always written, like every word was measured before it was committed to paper. "Nora, don't open this with them in the room. Go to Edinburgh. Go alone. The key opens more than a door. Trust what you find. Granda." I folded the note before my stepmother could crane her neck far enough to read it. I closed my fingers around the key. "At least it's a free vacation," my brother said. The drive home was one of the longest I can remember. The city moved around me in streaks of gray and wet asphalt, and I kept turning the key over in my hand at red lights, feeling the ridges, the weight of it, wondering if this was actually nothing. A storage unit full of old furniture, old papers, the physical remnants of a man who'd spent 40 years collecting things that didn't matter to anyone except him. My grandfather had been a quiet man. He'd never talked about money. He'd taken me to the public library every Saturday until I was 12 and taught me to play chess on a board with a cracked corner that he'd owned since before my dad was born. He wore the same cardigan for 3 winters. He drove a truck that was 10 years older than me. I did not know what to make of the key. I did not throw it away. 2 nights later, I booked a flight to Edinburgh. My dad called the next morning. He said it the way he always said hard things, measured, preemptive, like he was cutting off an argument before it started. "I hope you're not reading too much into this, Nora. Your grandfather loved you, but he wasn't always practical. It might just be some old books. Some papers." I told him I understood. He paused. "You could just have the unit cleared by a local service. Save yourself the trip." I told him I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. I told my supervisor I needed a week of personal leave, packed a single bag, and left on a Thursday morning before anyone could talk me out of it. The flight was 8 hours. I spent most of it watching the dark Atlantic through the oval window, the key sitting on the tray table in front of me. I kept reading the note. "The key opens more than a door." He'd used that phrasing before. "When we played chess, it opens more than a move. Nora, every piece you place opens the board or closes it." He was always talking in layers. I'd spent years thinking it was just something old men did. Now I wasn't sure. Edinburgh arrived in the early morning, pale gold light over gray stone. the air cold and sharp and smelling of rain and something older than weather. The cab driver from the airport had a thick accent and pointed out the castle on the hill like it was something new. I looked at it for a long moment. I felt strangely calm. Lockwood Self-Storage sat on a quiet street in the Leith district, near the waterfront. A woman at the front desk cross-checked my name against a file that was apparently already expecting me, which sent a small, specific chill through my chest. She handed me a visitor's log. The last entry before my name was from 14 months ago. The name written there was my grandfather's. Unit 14 was at the end of a concrete corridor. The key fit perfectly. The door swung open onto a space that smelled of cedar and old paper, and for a moment I just stood in the doorway and breathed it in. It was not full of furniture. There was a metal filing cabinet, locked, with a second key taped to the underside of the top drawer, smaller than mine, silver, labeled simply RC. There was a flat wooden box containing a chessboard, the same one we'd played on, cracked corner and all, the missing pawn absent from its square. There was a leather portfolio embossed with the initials G.H.W., my grandfather's full name, Gordon Harold West, and beside it, a sealed envelope with my name on the front in the same steady handwriting. I sat down on the concrete floor. I opened the envelope first. Nora, if you're reading this, you made the trip. I knew you would. You're the only one who ever followed through on anything. What's in the portfolio is the part of my life I kept separate from your father, separate from the family, separate because I had to, after I understood what they were capable of. RC stands for Redwood Capital. Find the address on the first page. They're expecting you. You have an appointment at 10 a.m. On the day after you arrive, I arranged it before I was too sick to arrange anything else. Ask for Mr. Calloway. He'll explain what the key opens. All my love, always, Grandpa. I checked the date on the portfolio. It had been drafted 16 months ago. He had known he was running out of time. The next morning I took a cab to an address in the new town. A clean Georgian building on a quiet corner with a brass plaque beside the door that read, Redwood Capital Private Asset Management. Inside, the receptionist greeted me by name before I gave it. She led me to a corner office where a man in his late 50s stood to meet me, silver-haired, unhurried, with the particular steadiness of someone who has spent a career being calm in rooms where other people were not. He said, Miss West, I'm Thomas Calloway. Please sit down. I've been looking forward to this meeting for quite some time. I sat. He opened a folder. What he told me over the next 90 minutes rearranged everything I thought I knew about my grandfather. Redwood Capital had been founded quietly, 11 years ago, registered under a holding entity in Scotland, funded entirely by my grandfather's personal assets, money he'd accumulated over decades in ways no one in our family had ever asked about. Because no one in our family had ever thought to ask. He was the quiet one. He was the cardigan and the library and the chessboard. He was not, apparently, limited to those things. 11 years ago, according to Mr. Calloway, my grandfather had gone to my father with a serious concern. He'd discovered that certain funds within Hartwell Industries were being redirected not fraudulently, not quite, but strategically, in ways that reduced his stake without his formal consent, through a series of restructured equity arrangements my brother had helped facilitate. He'd gone to my father directly. My father had told him he was confused, that he was misreading the documents, that he needed to rest and stop worrying about things he no longer fully understood. My grandfather had understood perfectly. He had simply chosen not to fight it publicly. Instead, he'd taken what remained of his personal stake and moved it. Quietly, patiently. Over years, he'd built Redwood Capital into a holding structure that owned, among other things, a 48% passive interest in Hartwell Industries through layered acquisition, more than enough, when combined with the residual shares that had never been formally reassigned, to constitute a controlling position. And under the terms of his private will, registered in Scotland, that position now belonged to me. I stared at the documents for a long time. Mr. Calloway let me. He didn't rush, didn't fill the silence with reassurances, just waited with the quiet patience of a man who had delivered this kind of information before and understood that it required space. Why me? I finally asked. He looked at me evenly. Because you were the only one he trusted, and because he believed that what you do with something matters more than that you have it. There was a second folder. He slid it across the desk. He also left instructions, Mr. Calloway said, for a specific course of action, should you choose to take it. It involves a shell acquisition offer through a UK-registered entity called Meridian Property Group. On paper, it looks like an outside buyer. In practice, you would be purchasing full operational control of Hartwell Industries from your father and brother at a fair market price above market, actually, because he wanted them to have no legitimate grounds to contest it. I opened the folder. The numbers were significant. The structure was airtight. 16 months ago, already ill, my grandfather had written a plan that was waiting for me to arrive and decide whether to execute it. He planned this while he was sick? I asked. He planned this instead of getting treatment, Mr. Calloway said quietly. He told me once that he'd had enough of fighting the wrong battles. He wanted his last move to be the right one. I went back to the storage unit that afternoon and sat on the floor for a long time. I took the chessboard out of the wooden box and set it up on the concrete, piece by piece, the missing pawn absent from its square the way it always had been. He used to say the missing pawn was intentional, a reminder that you sometimes play with what you have, not what you wish you had, and the difference between a good player and a bad one is that the good player uses the gap. I called Mr. Calloway the next morning. I told him to prepare the offer. The next 4 days were a quiet blur of document reviews, legal consultations, and long walks along the Edinburgh waterfront in the cold afternoon light. Mr. Calloway's team was thorough and discreet. The offer from Meridian Property Group would appear, to any outside observer, as a standard strategic acquisition, a British firm with a clean record and an above-market bid for a mid-sized American real estate developer. My father and brother would see a lifeline, not a trap. Hartwell Industries had been quietly struggling. I'd seen enough of the financials to understand that my brother's restructuring had been more reckless than strategic, and that the company's apparent health was largely cosmetic. They would want to sell. I flew home on a Tuesday. The city came up through the clouds exactly as it always did, gray and wide and familiar, and I sat with my hands folded in my lap and felt something in my chest that wasn't quite calm but was close to it. Resolution, maybe. The particular clarity that comes after a long time of not knowing which direction to move. I went back to my apartment. I unpacked. I made coffee and stood by the window for a while, watching the street below. 3 days later, my dad called. His voice was different from how it usually sounded. There was something underneath the usual composure, a tension he was working to keep out of the words but couldn't quite manage. He said there was an acquisition offer on the table for Hartwell, out of the UK, and that it was a serious one. Above market, he said. Clean terms. No staff cuts for 18 months. He said he and my brother had looked it over carefully and that it seemed like a real opportunity given where the company was financially. He said, I know you don't have much involvement with the business side, Nora, but I wanted you to know. I think we're going to take it. I said that sounded like a reasonable decision. He said, your grandfather would have had opinions about this. A pause. He always did. I said I thought Grandpa would have wanted what was best for everyone. After I hung up, I stood by the window for a long time. The offer was accepted on a Friday. Meridian Property Group finalized the acquisition of Hartwell Industries at 4:47 inches the afternoon, Eastern Time. Mr. Calloway's team sent a confirmation to my email at 5:03. I read it twice, then set my phone face down on the kitchen table and made dinner. My brother texted me that evening. Dad says we sold the company. Not sure how I feel about it, but the money's right. You doing okay? I replied, I'm good. Hope you are too. I gave it 2 weeks. 2 weeks of signing paperwork, reviewing the transition structure, speaking with Mr. Calloway and the Redwood Capital team about the operational plan for Hartwell under new ownership. 2 weeks of passing my family in ordinary life, a Sunday call with my dad, a brief text exchange with my brother while holding something they couldn't see. Then I invited them to dinner. I sent the message on a Wednesday morning. Short, specific, no particular ceremony. Dinner at my place Saturday, 7 p.m. I have something I want to share with you. My stepmother called within 2 hours, her voice carrying that particular lightness she used when she was actually suspicious. She asked for the address. I gave her one she didn't recognize. She asked whose apartment it was. I told her it was mine. She said, "Your apartment is on Birchwood, isn't it?" I told her I'd moved. Saturday arrived cold and clear, the kind of Chicago November evening that makes the city look like it was designed to be photographed. I stood in the front room of the Harrington townhouse, 3 floors, high ceilings, a fireplace in the main room that I had lit an hour before they arrived, and watched headlights pull into the street below. I heard the car doors. I heard my brother say something I couldn't make out, and then a silence that meant he'd seen the front of the building. I opened the door before they knocked. My dad looked at the foyer the way certain men look at things that unsettle them carefully, without expression, like the lack of reaction is itself a kind of control. My stepmother's eyes moved across the room too quickly, cataloging. My brother walked in behind them and stopped in the middle of the entryway and turned in a slow half-circle, taking in the ceiling height, the staircase, the painting above the mantel. "Nice place," he said, with the specific inflection of someone who means the opposite and doesn't quite have time to construct a better response. "Thank you," I said. "I like it." Dinner was set in the dining room. I'd kept it simple, nothing that looked like I was trying to perform wealth for them, because I wasn't. We sat, and for the first 40 minutes it was almost ordinary. The way family dinners manage to be ordinary even when every person at the table is measuring something. My dad talked about the Hartwell transition, about the relief of having a clean exit at a strong price. My brother talked about what he was planning to do with his share. My stepmother asked me careful questions about what I'd been up to since the trip to Scotland, her voice carrying the same brightness she always used when she was actually asking a different question. I answered straightforwardly. I said Scotland had been interesting, that I'd found more than I expected in the storage unit. My dad looked at me. "What kind of more?" I set down my fork. I reached under my chair and placed the leather portfolio on the table, the same one from the storage unit, initialed G, H, double, the one I'd carried back from Edinburgh in my carry-on bag. I slid it to the center of the table. "You should look at this," I said. My dad opened it with the deliberateness of a man who is already steeling himself. He read the first page slowly, then the second. His face didn't change immediately, it changed in stages, the way something structural gives way, not all at once. My stepmother leaned to look. My brother leaned forward from his side of the table. No one said anything for a long time. Then my dad looked up at me, and for the first time that evening, maybe for the first time in years, he looked at me the way you look at someone you are genuinely seeing. Not managing, not accounting for, seeing. "Redwood Capital," he said. "Yes. He built this. He built this after." "After you told him he was confused," I said. "Yes." My brother leaned back. "The acquisition," he said it quietly. Not quite a question. "Meridian Property Group." "Is me," I said. "Yes." The fireplace crackled. Outside, a car passed on the street. My stepmother set down her glass very slowly. "You bought the company," my dad said. "I bought the company. With his money. With what he built after your restructuring left him with nothing to work with inside Hartwell. He didn't go quietly, he just went somewhere you couldn't see." The silence after that was the longest of the evening. My brother stared at the portfolio like it might say something different if he looked at it long enough. My stepmother had stopped performing the expression she'd been performing all night and was just sitting with her real face, which was something I hadn't seen very often. My dad was quiet for a while. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "You could have come to me with this." "He didn't come to you," I said. "You told him he was confused. He absorbed that. He didn't argue with it." "What happens now?" he asked. I had thought carefully about this part. I'd thought about it on the floor of that storage unit in Edinburgh, and on the plane home, and in the weeks since. I'd thought about what my grandfather had written, "Do not use this as a weapon, Nora. Use it as a door," and I'd thought about what kind of person I wanted to be at the end of this. "The company will be restructured properly," I said. "The employees keep their jobs. The operations stay in Chicago. I'll be making the decisions going forward, and I'll be making them the way he would have wanted, carefully, with real numbers, not cosmetic ones." I looked at my brother. "You can stay on in an advisory role if you want. You know the operations. But you report to the team I'm putting in place, not the other way around." My brother stared at me for a moment. "An advisory role," he repeated. That's what I'm offering. He looked at the portfolio. He looked at me. Something shifted in his expression that I didn't have a clean name for. It wasn't quite humility, but it was adjacent to it. Fine, he said. I looked at my dad. You spent 30 years building something real. The foundation of Hartwell is sound. It's the recent years that were the problem. I'd like your insight on the historical contracts, the long-term relationships, the things that actually made the company worth something before the restructuring. But I need you to understand that the structure has changed. I'm not asking permission. I'm offering you a role in something worth rebuilding. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that my stepmother put her hand on his arm, which was the first genuinely tender thing I'd seen her do all evening. He chose you, my dad said finally. Not accusatory, just factual. He chose the person who would use it right, I said. He told me that's how he saw it, and I think he still loved you. He wrote about you. There was a letter he called you his greatest pride and his deepest disappointment in the same sentence. I think those things were both true. Something in my dad's face did something I couldn't quite watch straight on. I looked down at the table for a moment to give him the space. We did not have a dramatic resolution that night. No one wept or embraced. My dad didn't apologize, and I didn't ask him to. My brother was quiet for the rest of dinner in a way that felt like processing rather than resentment. My stepmother asked, near the end, about the chessboard. She'd noticed it on the shelf in the front room when they walked in, the old one with the cracked corner. Set up mid-game, a pawn missing from its square. His? She asked. His, I said. He wanted me to keep it. She looked at it for a moment, and then nodded, and didn't say anything else. After they left, I stood in the front room alone for a while. The fire had burned down to a low, steady orange. The city was quiet outside the tall windows. I picked up the brass key from the side table where I'd left it Unit 14. Lockwood Self-Storage, Edinburgh. The key that had started all of this and turned it over in my palm. He had been dead for 4 months when I first held this key in a law office and didn't know what it meant. He'd been gone since March quietly, at home, in the early morning, the way he'd lived most of his life. No announcement, no ceremony. He'd made his arrangements long before the end, and apparently spent his last good months making sure those arrangements were exactly right. I thought about him driving to that storage unit on a trip I hadn't known he'd taken, placing the portfolio and the chessboard and the note with the kind of precision that only belongs to people who have thought very carefully about what they're doing. I thought about him writing my name on that envelope. I thought about the way he used to sit across the chessboard from me on Saturday afternoons when I was 9 years old, letting me think I was the one making the strategy, while he quietly arranged the pieces of a much longer game. I carried the key upstairs and set it on the nightstand beside the bed. In the morning I would call Mr. Calloway. There were transition meetings to schedule, operations to review, decisions that needed to be made with care and clarity and the kind of patience that my grandfather had spent 40 years practicing and then, in the end, passed directly to me. I turned off the light. Outside, the city was quiet. The first snow of November had started while we were at dinner. I could see it now, soft and steady through the window, settling on the street below without any particular urgency, the way things settle when they've finally found where they belong. I closed my eyes. He had told me once, near the end of a long Saturday game when I was 12 and frustrated because I couldn't see how to win, that the most important thing a chess player ever learns isn't the opening or the end game or the names of the famous combinations. It's that the board always tells you what it needs, if you're willing to stop talking and listen to it. I thought I was starting to understand what he meant. I thought he'd known, all along, that I would.